Welcome to the Empowered Flow podcast. I'm Tris Alexandra, holistic clinical nutritionist, women's health and menstrual cycle educator, and mama. Join me and experts in nutrition, fitness, mindset, and holistic healing as we explore conversations to open your mind to a different way of thinking on all things women's health, hormones, periods, cyclical living, and fertility. Whether you're seeking knowledge, inspiration, or a supportive community, you've found your tribe. Let's dive in. I begin this episode by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and waterways of which I work, live and play, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome back, it's Tris here for a solo episode today, and I'm sitting here at around 34 weeks pregnant if you are listening to this around the time that this episode lands. And because of that, I wanted to share a series on preconception, pregnancy, postpartum to really, support you through that journey because gosh, what a journey. I will have some solo episodes. So I want to talk to you today about my own story, my own journey. And then I'll also share an episode on nutrition for preconception and pregnancy, postpartum. And then I've got some guest episodes coming up on various different topics to do with your preconception and pregnancy and postpartum journey. Now, the reason why I really wanted to share, I just felt called to share my story and journey for a couple of reasons. One, I've really loved listening to other women's stories, and I think we can just learn and take away so much wisdom from hearing from other women, and I guess there's a feeling of connection when we realize that we're not alone in this journey. But I also wanted to share it from the perspective of, helping you to know that you do actually have options when it comes to your pregnancy and birth. I think it's important to know that, regardless of what stage of our health journey we're on, but including in pregnancy and childbirth, that we do actually have options and you can decide what's actually important to you. So for me, I really sat with it to decide what's important to me in pregnancy and birth. What options do I have? What path do I want to take? So it's really important to know that we do have options. And that means weighing up the risks and benefits of different, potentially routine examinations and different things that are, typically traditionally done in pregnancy and birth, but also knowing that what you choose is going to be so different. It's different for every woman, and I'm going to share a little bit about my journey with that. But before I fell pregnant the first time, I really had no idea. Of course, I knew about options and understanding, asking questions when it came to my health journey, but I never thought about it when it came to pregnancy and birth because it's not something that I looked into. So that's why I wanted to share this episode. I just want to put a disclaimer that what I share in here is my story and my personal experiences. It is certainly not medical advice or healthcare advice or personalized advice to you. So please, just take this information with a grain of salt and please do your research and speak to your healthcare provider because it is certainly not intended for medical advice. I also want to, preface this episode by saying that everyone's going to have different thoughts and opinions and beliefs, and what I weigh up as risk versus benefits of something and feel comfortable with is going to be so different to someone else, and the choices that I make in my pregnancy and birth is going to be so different for every woman out there. So I share this as my personal experience and my personal thoughts. So it's certainly my own experience and my own feelings towards things that happened in my birth is certainly, and in my pregnancy is certainly not a judgment or it's not, I don't have any opinions about what anyone else decides for them. And I also share this episode with just a lot of love because there's so much emotions and things that come up when we talk about pregnancy and birth. And I know it can be, really triggering and really emotional for a lot of women. I know even my own previous birth I held a lot of emotion about that for quite a long time. So I share this with just so much love. And if anything comes up, if you feel triggered or anything comes up for you by listening to this, then please reach out to me on DMs on Instagram at Tris Alexandra Nutrition. My DMs are open, or speak to someone about it and get some guidance and some help with whatever's coming up for you. So yeah, that's where I wanted to start the episode. It's really been through my own journey through both pregnancies and one birth that my eyes have been really opened, like through both research and through personal experiences, on how our modern culture and society and how our medical system views birth and views women, and how feared it is. Like if you look at the language that's used with women, both through my personal experience and through women that I've spoken to, and the language that's used at, routine appointments and things like that. And it can be quite like fearful and coercive language that's used often, and that's because we fear birth as a society. You can only look to movies and TV shows, and anytime a woman's giving birth, it's usually on her back, screaming, maybe legs up in stirrups, a whole bunch of medical team around her, and it's all frantic and traumatic. And I'm not at all saying that medical intervention is never needed in birth. So just just know that that's not what I'm saying. I do have a really strong belief that birth is a perfectly natural physiological process. And actually, in fact, in my first birth, in my first pregnancy, learning about that natural physiological process and the beautiful hormones and like how our bodies just have this incredible innate wisdom to do something it's never done before. Like you don't actually have to do anything to give birth apart from potentially really getting out of our own way. Our body does all of that. It holds, every cell in our body knows what to do and holds this innate wisdom. And that's not to say, like I said, it's not to say that medical intervention is never needed. But I do really strongly believe that, and, from the research I've done, that birth is becoming highly medicalized, and in many cases, potentially unnecessarily so. And it means that women are walking away from childbirth having really quite traumatic experiences. And I watched actually in my first pregnancy, the Birth Time documentary came out, which I would highly recommend anyone on this journey watching. And then in my second pregnancy, the Born at Home documentary came out. So both very similar, talking about natural physiological birth and the medical system and how how we view birth and, going through different women's experiences and stories. And so many women experience birth trauma. Like it's so heartbreaking to me. Like I've had friends that have experienced really traumatic births and left them really emotionally scarred. And in one of the documentaries, I remember them saying that, often women are treated as just a vesicle for a baby to come out of, and everyone's concerned about the baby, and rightly so, but we forget about the mothers. And a woman should walk away, they said this in the documentary, but a woman should walk away from birth physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually intact, and that's not happening. And so I think it's really important to have these discussions and to know that when it comes to your pregnancy and birth, that you do have options and you do need to advocate for your health and your preferences. And there are things that you need to make decisions on in pregnancy and birth, and no one can or should make those decisions for you. They really are, you really have to tune into what feels right for you and what doesn't. And on that, I wanted to share this quote by Dr. Sarah Wickham, who is an author, a PhD researcher, and it was in her book, What's Right for Me, Making Decisions in Pregnancy and Childbirth. And she says, Birth is about so much more than the wriggling of a tiny body out of a larger one. When we birth, we don't just birth babies, we birth ourselves, we birth our families, and we reshape our lives. So I'll link Dr. Sarah Wickham in the show notes and also any other resources that I mention in this episode. But I did want to start with sharing my journey, my preconception and pregnancy and birth story from my last pregnancy first. I haven't written any notes on this, so this whole episode is going to come out just raw and messy and probably all over the place because I do go off in tangents and forget where I was actually at. So I'm just going to trust that it comes out how it comes out. So I want to take you back to preconception, first pregnancy. Now, I was still studying nutrition at the time. I was still at uni, and my husband and I we decided, well, before we got married, we talked a lot about having children, whether we wanted them, whether we didn't, what our lives would look like with or without them, our parenting styles, and so many different things. And we actually got married. We still hadn't decided if having children was for us. And it wasn't until a little while after we were married that we had the conversation again. I think by this stage I was sort of 34, getting close to 35. And I thought, well, if we're going to do it, I kind of want to do it like now, like soon, because we decided if we wanted to have one, we were going to have two. And I just personally wanted to have children by the time I was 40, and not that there's anything wrong with having children after 40. I know plenty of women who do. But that was just what we decided. And so we thought, well, let's do some preconception care. Let's get our body in the best possible place that we can. I did have a history of PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, but something that I'd worked on for a long time. And I have been supporting my hormones and supporting and living in a way that keeps me, I guess, optimally hormonally healthy for a long time. And even, my husband, he really looks after his health as well. And so we definitely dialed it up a notch. We were healthy, but we definitely dialed it up a notch. We did a little bit of like a detox phase. We gave up alcohol for a little while. We used different supplements for both the detox phase and then obviously preconception, where it was more targeted to preconception care. So things like, really high quality, prenatal multivitamins, really good quality omega-3 with high DHA, vitamin D, some nutrients like CoQ10 or ubiquinol for egg quality. So a couple of different things that we did. I also saw my naturopath because I love herbal medicine as well, and she prescribed some like a beautiful herb mix for me. And my husband did a lot of preconception care as well. So I actually have someone coming on the podcast talking all about men's health and fertility for men. So we'll talk more about that, and I'll talk about how my husband iced his balls in as preconception care for our first. So yeah, that was our preconception care we did, and we did it for quite a while, like probably a good 9 months before we even started thinking about trying, because even though we were healthy, like I said, we just really wanted to give ourselves the best chance of falling pregnant naturally. We had made the decision, and again, this is a very personal decision, but we had made the decision that if we didn't fall pregnant naturally, that we wouldn't go down any other paths. And that's not like, I think it's absolutely incredible, and we should be so incredibly grateful that we have the medicine and the science to assist women and couples in falling pregnant when they've, exhausted all other options. So please don't take that as my thoughts or judgment on that. Like, it really just was a personal decision that we'd made. I actually don't know if I'd feel differently if things didn't go the way they went. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, so we decided to start trying. I was actually still at uni, and it was COVID, it was lockdown. We actually got married the week before the very first lockdown in Melbourne, and it was like months and months after that. And we thought, well, let's just start trying, because it could take a while. Could be 6 months, could be longer, could be shorter, who knows. Did not actually expect to fall pregnant straight away. And I don't share that often. I really don't, because I work in the fertility space, and I have, friends that have had really heartbreaking fertility challenges and journey. And yeah, a little part of me feels really guilty for sharing that. And yeah, so that was our story. That was what happened. So we started trying. I fell pregnant the first cycle we started trying, but did have a very early pregnancy loss. I hadn't actually even tested for pregnancy. I hadn't been to the doctor. I was just tracking my cycle. I knew exactly when I ovulated. I knew exactly when my period was due. And when it didn't come, I was like, oh, maybe I'm pregnant. No, surely not. Surely I couldn't be. So I kind of left it for a few days, and then I think it was about 5 days later, before I'd even taken a test, I started bleeding. And I knew it was a pregnancy loss because of what I experienced, even without having taken a test. So when that happened, I definitely did feel a little bit of fear and worry, and thought, well, what if my body can't do this? It was certainly the fears that came up from all the way back when I was first diagnosed with PCOS, and, having a doctor say to me, well, you won't be able to fall pregnant naturally. And so those fears definitely resurfaced. And it was interesting because I'd always held that fear in the back of my mind, like, what if my body can't do this thing that women's bodies are made to do? But also part of me just had a knowing that it would be okay. I know that's very strange to say. Anyway, the following cycle, the next month, I did fall pregnant with my now son. And that was it was such a big shock because, like I said, we didn't expect to fall pregnant so quickly. I was still studying. The last trimester of uni was just such a joy, getting through in my first trimester when I was like nauseous and fatigued. It wasn't too bad. My first pregnancy. I certainly had nausea every day. It was like persistent daily, but not significant, like I wasn't vomiting, or it wasn't significant like that. And certainly fatigue. Being locked down, it just meant that we didn't have a lot to do, so I could, go to uni online, work online, or whatever I was doing, and then have a bit of a snooze. So that kind of got me through. I didn't really have any, big cravings or anything like that. But what I did experience, so this is my first pregnancy. I'd never looked into different options when it came to pregnancy and birth. I never thought about it. I went to the doctor when I did fall pregnant and to go and get tests, and he sat there and he Googled what I needed to test. And look, I know doctors have a lot of things to remember and to know, but I thought surely women get pregnant every day, and it's just some standard tests that you should know. And I'm sure not, like I'm certain not all doctors would be like that, but it was just one little sort of like yellow flag in my mind going, oh, okay. Anyway, he recommended to me to get a scan, and he told me it needed to be like 12 weeks. And so I booked that in. What I didn't realize, and what he sort of didn't tell me, was I actually booked it in at the wrong time. And when I turned up for the scan, they said, oh no, it actually needs to be 13 weeks. You're too early, so we'll need to do a dating scan and you'll need to come back. And I was like, oh, great. Anyway, I can't remember. Look, it's going back so long, so I can't remember the exact timeline. But at the time I was going to this gym, and I'd been going to this gym for years. And maybe gyms must have still been open at this stage. I know we're in lockdown, but gyms must have still been open. And I went to the gym one morning, or maybe it was a little bit later in my pregnancy, but I went to the gym one morning and I looked up a couple of doors down from my gym. There was a sign that said My Midwives, and it was the midwife clinic. And I'd never noticed this sign. I'd been going there for years and never noticed. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what they do. And so while I was at the gym that day, I Googled, looked online at their website, realised that they were private midwives, that they did home and hospital births. It meant that you had continuity of care during your entire pregnancy, and you didn't, necessarily then need to go into hospital. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. This is what I want. Like, I had no idea that was an option. I also had never had anyone around me that had had home birthed or had really, I guess, done anything differently from the typical going to see a doctor, going into hospital or having an obstetrician, whatever that sort of, I guess, that standard model of care. And so I'd never been exposed to even thinking about other options. And like I said, never researched it. So that was like a big part of me wanting to share this episode, was because if maybe you're in the same journey as I was, and maybe you didn't know that there were other options, you hadn't thought about it, you hadn't researched it yet. Anyway, so I decided to book in with this private midwife group, and chose one of the midwives and went in to see them, had a conversation and thought, this is exactly what I want. It means that I just felt like a level of trust. It meant that I could go and see the same midwife, have all my tests done through them, have, build a relationship and a rapport with someone that I could trust and have conversations with about different things that came up without it being someone different every time. And I will say that, that might not be for everybody. Obviously, my own experiences with feeling disempowered and not being given options in previous health experiences and journeys has led me to feel that that's my need. So that really spoke to me, and I really, that was the choice that we made, was to have this private midwife. I didn't actually decide at the time to have a home birth. We decided that we would do a hospital birth, but with the private midwives, I would labour at home as long as possible, and then we'd transfer into hospital for the birth, because I really wanted to have a very, very low, like minimal intervention pregnancy and birth. I didn't want to have unnecessary tests and be, I guess, poked and prodded unnecessarily. There was certain things that I, through doing then research and having conversations with a midwife, that didn't sit well with me, and I didn't want to have those things happen, and I wanted to be able to have a natural birth. So that to me was, in my opinion and in what I felt, was the best model of care for what I wanted. And certainly there are many different options and different models of care that you can choose. It really just depends, like I said at the very start, like it's all about your options and weighing up the risks and benefits, and knowing that there are different options, and knowing, like, it's also understanding like what is actually important to me in my pregnancy and birth. Anyway, so I went back to the doctor. I think I had to pick up like some test results, or maybe it was from the scan, and he said, we need to do your referral for the hospital. And I said, no, actually you don't need to. I'm now working with a private midwife, and they do the hospital booking and they do all the appointments and tests and things like that. And he said, what do you mean? You can't do that? I said, well, yes, I can. That's what a midwife does. And he said, no, you have to have a doctor and an obstetrician. And I said, well, no, actually I don't. They are a registered midwife. This is the work that they do. And so it just sort of, I thought it was really interesting. And obviously, again, not every doctor is going to have that opinion and think like that, but obviously, again, there is some disconnect within the system of, I guess, how pregnancy and birth should go, and who should be looking after the women, and how that looks, and, what midwives do. But when you think back to our ancestors, it was the women, it was the midwives, it was the mothers and the grandmothers that were there at birth, that held the wisdom and held the knowledge and passed that down through generations. And they were the birth keepers. They were the ones that were there with women. That's just what I really felt into. Now, I will say I did have a really straightforward pregnancy the first time. I didn't have any complications. It was really great having them, I had this beautiful support by my midwives, because every routine test and things that they came up, they would discuss with me like, okay, this is what's normally recommended. Here is, the research around it. Here is the risk versus benefits. If you do have it, this is what could happen. If you don't have it, this is what could happen. This is, I think something to really understand, and something that stood out to me, was understanding the cascade of interventions that can happen during pregnancy and birth, and understanding how any of those routine tests could lead to interventions and into another interventions and really change the course of your pregnancy. So, I think that's something important to research and to know about. I'm certainly not going to, in this episode, go through the research in any of those things, because I think each, if I think about the tests, even in the routine tests that are done in pregnancy, each of those really needs a whole episode to discuss what the research actually says, and that's not something that I'm going to do. I'm just sharing my experience. But what I would say is, if you do want to learn more, one of my absolute favorite podcasts is The Great Birth Rebellion. It's hosted by a midwife, and they really just share the facts and figures and the research on each of these different topics so that you can have discussions with your healthcare providers and weigh up what your options are and what you want to decide. I've totally lost my train of thought and where I was going with that. But I'll talk about tests and the tests that I guess opted for and didn't opt for in my pregnancy. So I guess the first one with ultrasounds is I just wanted to have minimal ultrasounds. I didn't want to have, and I was okay with the routine important ones, like the 20-week scan where they look at the anatomy and, can look at where your placenta is and all of those sort of things. I was comfortable with that, but I wasn't comfortable with having unnecessary ultrasounds and having that exposure. What I did experience at the 20-week scan, actually, I went in and she started scanning my belly, and the sonographer or radiologist, and she said, are you sure you're 20 weeks? Because this baby looks really big. And I, first time pregnancy, first time doing all this, I thought, oh God. And you start to run those thoughts in your head. Oh, what if my baby's big? What if is something wrong? And I said, no, I'm sure. And she said, oh, okay. And then she did the scan. And then at the end she said, oh no, it's not really big. It's just got really long legs. And I was like, okay, thank you for that. Thank you for me sitting in fear for this last, it's just kind of these throwaway comments that without the right bedside manner, in my opinion, that can be really, I guess, fearful, and in other ways can be quite coercive, that I don't necessarily, that don't sit well with me. I'm going to say. The other test that we talked about and that I did have in my first pregnancy, I didn't have in this one, was the oral glucose tolerance test for gestational diabetes. So the reason why I had it in the first one is I had a conversation with the midwives, and they were pretty adamant, actually. They were really, I guess it was the one thing that I would say that they were probably a little bit you should probably really consider having this test, because I had the history of PCOS. And I had the conversation with them that I didn't have insulin resistant PCOS. Yes, 70 to 80% of women with PCOS have that, but I'd never had any high fasting insulin or high fasting glucose. I knew my body really well. I knew I didn't have any concerns around that. And from my opinion, I guess as a practitioner, there are other and better ways of testing if you have any issues with insulin or blood glucose issues. And for gestational diabetes and the oral glucose tolerance test, 70 grams of sugar on an empty stomach is going to potentially cause insulin issues for a lot of people. That is a lot of sugar, and it's certainly a lot more sugar than I would ever consume probably in a week, let alone in one sitting. So I did have that in the first pregnancy. I didn't have it in this one. What I did have instead was fasting insulin and fasting glucose. That is enough from my understanding of the research and as a practitioner to show any risks of gestational diabetes or any issues with blood glucose and insulin. The other thing you can also test for is something called HbA1c, which is a marker of your blood glucose regulation over a 3-month period. The reason being is, and just something to consider and something to chat to your healthcare providers about, is that if you test positive for that, you need to consider what does that mean in terms of the treatment. Which typically what is recommended is a low-carb diet if you test positive for gestational diabetes. And research shows that it doesn't actually change pregnancy and birth outcomes. So, and I also would question whether a low-carb diet is the right approach. And certainly we would need to look at carbohydrates and moderate carbohydrates and the type and everything like that. But what we actually really need to be looking at is your blood glucose regulation, and that's not just carbohydrates. That's protein, fats, fiber, it's stress, it's sleep, it's your metabolic health, it's many other things. So I'm certainly not saying don't test for it or don't screen for it, so please don't take that. It's just that for me, the oral glucose tolerance test was not the right test or the most appropriate test that I felt that I wanted to have for that. And so I chose something else. I also, the other test that is routinely done later on in pregnancy is Group B strep or GBS, and I declined that test. I declined at both pregnancies. So Group B strep is a opportunistic bacteria that can reside in the vaginal microbiome, in the lower part of the vagina. It's a transient bacteria, and that means that you could test positive for that and then weeks later test negative. And it's usually done late in pregnancy, I think around 35 weeks. But again, please don't quote me on this. I'm not a midwife. It's not my area of expertise, and I would definitely recommend doing further research. But what I would say is that, so my understanding actually of the statistics is that 20% of women will have GBS, but there's also a difference between having that bacteria reside in you and having an actual infection of that bacteria. So it is an opportunistic bacteria. It can overgrow in certain environments. And you, again, need to think about what's the actual treatment for that and the cascade of interventions that happens with that, because they do give massive doses of antibiotics before birth for that. Certainly, if you had any signs of infection, fever, other signs of infection, again, there's no, of course you would want to treat that, but in healthy women, and actually it's really one that you would want to know the research about, because there is the possibility of infection in a newborn, and that can have serious complications. So definitely something to look into. But for me, I chose not to have that test. Instead, I do actually support my vaginal microbiome with strain-specific probiotics, and I did that last pregnancy and this pregnancy as well, to help keep a healthy vaginal microbiome environment, and reduce, I guess, the risk of any opportunistic bacteria that could overgrow. So for me, after the 20-week scan, that was kind of it when it came to any other testing or routine exams. We did decide, we decided that we would have a hospital birth and labour at home as long as possible. And I'll kind of skip forward and take you forward to, the other thing I did do during pregnancy is a lot of body work. So I worked with an osteo, a chiropractor, and an acupuncturist, and did a lot of body work just to get help prepare my body, get baby in the best position possible for labor and birth, get my body prepared as much as possible. I worked with an exercise physiologist to make some changes to the training that I was doing, because I was doing a lot of compound lifts, and so we just made some changes along my pregnancy, and also to, I guess, like he said, get me fit for birth, because it's like running a marathon, and it truly is. So I did do that, but I'll fast forward to the birth, because what a wild ride. So I was 40 plus 4 weeks pregnant, so 4 days over my quote unquote due date, which most babies are not born on their due date, but one night, was at home doing some of the spinning babies exercises on their website. So if you want to learn a little bit about optimal positioning of babies, that's what I looked at and what we used. And anyway, my husband was doing this exercise thing on me where you would go on all fours, and they wrap like a sling or a towel or something up around your belly, give it a little lift. It's so nice. It takes all the heaviness and the pressure off you when you've got a really big belly, and give it a little wiggle, wiggle the hips, and it just sort of frees up your body, releases any tension in the hips and the belly, and it's so nice. Anyway, he did that and he stopped, and I sat up and I was like, oh, I've either wet myself, I've either peed my pants, or my waters just broke. And it wasn't a lot. It was really just a little bit. That's why I was like, I don't know what that was. And then I went to the toilet and lost my mucus plug, and I was like, okay, I think something's going on here. contacted my midwife, let her know I didn't have any contractions at this stage. So she was like, well, look, just let's just monitor it. We need to, see when your contractions start. Keep me updated with anything that happens or changes. But obviously things are starting. She said, get some rest. Because this was late at night. It was probably like 9 o'clock at night at this stage. Anyway, so we went to bed. My husband fell straight asleep and I started getting contractions. Just really mild, kind of like, I guess like I've not had a lot of period pain in my life, but like that period cramping, like the cramping of your uterus. And they, I guess over the course of the night, intensified. They were really sporadic though. So I'm talking like at the start, they were probably like 20 minutes apart. So I would lie in bed and then I'd get a contraction and I'd sort of wiggle around, or sometimes I'd get out of bed and then I'd get back in, try and fall back asleep. And just as I was like dozing off, another one would wake me up again. So they were strong enough to wake me. And I sort of started, I had a Swiss ball and I started like getting up every contraction and rocking on my Swiss ball because it felt really nice. Meanwhile, my husband's still fast asleep, which was kind of nice. So just kind of like, it was nice to just in the stillness and the darkness of the night, it was just nice to have that, I don't know, that I guess time to connect to myself and my body and everything that was happening. And at some stage during the night, I did wake him up and I got him to put on the TENS machine. So I had a girlfriend of mine lent her TENS machine to me and I used that for pain relief, which was so good. And then we woke up. So he went back to sleep, woke up in the morning at about, I think he woke up maybe around about 6 o'clock. It was quite early. And I was probably having, still very mild contractions, I would say. I spoke to the midwife and she said, well, look, come down. Your waters haven't fully broken. You're in, very, very early labor. So come down to the clinic and we'll do some monitoring, make sure Bubs is all right, listen to his heart, all of that kind of thing. And then, see where things are at. So we did that, but it probably wasn't until about 9 o'clock maybe that we went down there. In the meantime, just kept doing my thing at home. Went down to the clinic, got checked. Like we were there for quite a while, just chatting and monitoring and all of that kind of thing. The contractions were probably intensifying, but certainly not. She sort of was like, well, you're not in active labor yet. So go home and keep working through it. I'm going to go see someone today and then I'll come over and check on you again. And let me know if anything changes, that sort of thing. So we went home and I swear, like not long after we got home, things changed, like things ramped up. And actually the midwife had said to my husband, like, just time her contractions, monitor her contractions. And when it's this many minutes, this far apart, then give me a call. Anyway, so we get home. I definitely noticed things change. And I said to my husband, Flynn, I think something's changed. Like things are ramping up. Maybe we should tell the midwife, like it feels pretty intense. And he's like, no. She said like this many minutes apart for your contractions. And I was like, okay. Anyway, the intensity was really ramping up really quite quickly. And I think I said it a couple of times to him and he was like, no. And then eventually he was like, all right, well, I'll call her, and called her. And she was like, well, just put her in the shower for some pain relief. Probably still got quite a while to go. The shower will, feel really good, and I'll be there soon. Like she was a couple of suburbs away. I'll be there really soon. I get in the shower, and actually before I got in the shower, the contractions were really intense, and I started crying and saying to my husband, oh my God, I don't think I can do this. I've got hours, maybe even days to go. Like it's so hard and it's so uncomfortable. And I didn't know this, but for anyone listening and who knows the, I guess what's referred to as the transition point in labor, and it's when you're about 8 centimeters to 10 centimeters dilated. So when you get to that very final phase of labor to fully dilated, and you go through this transition, and a lot of women have what they call like a crisis of confidence when they feel like they can't do it, and it's really hard and it's really intense. And that's what I was going through, and I had no idea. And all of us thought that obviously I was way earlier on in my labor than I was. I had what's called like a precipitous labor, like a very fast second stage of labor. But anyway, I got in the shower not knowing this. that was so nice. Like just the hot water was like really nice for pain relief. And got out of the shower, walked into my lounge room, and I don't even think I was fully dressed yet. And I dropped to my knees, or like, I just had this urge to get down on my knees, and I dropped to my knees and I said to my husband, oh my God, this baby's coming. I need to push. Like, you need to call the midwife. This baby's coming. And he was like, what? And I was like, this baby's coming. I need to push. I feel I need to push. And he was like, oh my God. So he gets on the phone to the midwife. She's like, she hears me in the background, like moaning through contractions. And she's like, oh, I'm there. I'm going to be there in 7 minutes. Call an ambulance just in case they get there quicker than I do. But I'll be there. So my husband gets on the phone to an ambulance. Meanwhile, I'm still on the floor going, I need to push. He's looking at the door, just waiting for either the ambulance or the midwife to walk in, going, oh my God, like, what do I do? I've got to like just deliver this baby, catch his baby. So he's on the phone to the ambulance and they're like, someone's on their way, lie her on her back. And I was like, what do you mean on my back? Like we'd gone through all the classes and all the things about optimal positioning for birth. And the last thing we wanted to do, or the last thing I thought that I would do was get on my back, because it's not a great position. It's not a natural position for birth, and not an optimal position to open the pelvis and open up everything. So I lay on my back, like they said, and it was so intense. Like I had pain in my back when I lay on it, and I was like, I can't do this. I can't do it on my back. I have to be on my knees. And got up, and they're going, get towels. You're probably going to have to deliver this baby, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, poor husband's freaking out. Next minute, midwives walk in, ambulance walks in around about the same time. And yeah, I think we could just feel the tension leave the air when we realized that there were support people there. So, and actually, interestingly, I would feel so different about that now, like if that happened now. But anyway, I'll get into that when I talk about second birth. But anyway, once the midwives were there, they actually sent the ambulance away, because we decided, we realized that I was fully dilated and I was absolutely ready to birth this baby. So they sent them away, and we decided that home birth was going to be what we were going to do, because our midwife had called the other backup midwives. So we had 3 midwives with us. They had all the home birth kit. They had everything that we needed to have this baby at home. And in fact, I felt really good in that moment. Like I just had this. I'll tell you something I didn't share is the closer I got to the end of my pregnancy, the more pull I felt to home birth. I just had this, like, my body, my gut feeling, my intuition, whatever you want to call it. I just had this stronger and stronger urge to home birth. And I ignored it. I did talk to my husband about it, but I ignored it in the sense of I didn't choose to listen to my body and my intuition. And the reason why is because I had these fears I still had these fears, like, what if I can't do it? What if the pain's too much? What if I don't know how? All of these kind of things, which I would imagine are so normal to come up in pregnancy when you're going through something that you've never done before. And this is a thing, like, we still hold like such a fear around birth in our culture, and I still held that fear. And what I learned, and what I like reflecting back, what I didn't know at the time, is I could have made the choices that I wanted despite that fear, because yes, that fear was real. And I'm not denying the way that I felt, but when I thought about, I think it's really important to birth where you feel the safest, and that's not going to be at home for everyone, of course. When I thought about where I felt safest to birth and where where felt right for me, it was at home. But I really held on to these fears that I had about it, instead of working through those fears or working with those fears, and knowing that actually I did feel safe at home. I knew that I had midwives there who were medically trained, who had all of the things that we needed there. I knew what the risks were and the benefits were of home birth. And in fact, when I talk about like postpartum and I guess like debriefing on the birth and what happened, I felt for a long time such disappointment and such guilt around what happened with my birth and it was because I didn't listen to my intuition. I didn't listen to what I truly wanted. I know, like, when we made that decision as a couple, my husband was also like, well, hospital's probably a good idea because, we've never done this before. But I also know that if I said no, home birth is the right thing for me, he would have absolutely had my back and been on board with that. So yeah, like, we did choose to hospital birth, and this was obviously an unplanned home birth when it got to that stage, and I was on my lounge room floor pushing. But in that moment when the midwives were there and I realized that I thought I was going to have this baby at home, I just felt such a sense of like peace and like gratitude, like, yes, this was meant to be. I was meant to birth at home, and I this is actually what I want, and I feel completely safe to do this here. Like, it's really hard to describe the feeling I felt, but I was just so happy in that moment that was what was going to happen. So anyway, went on pushing. I pushed for like 3 hours at home, and this baby still hadn't come out. So actually, while I was pushing, I had, we tried different positions, but for a long part of it, I was leaning over a Swiss ball. I was on my knees, leaning over a Swiss ball, holding onto my husband, who was on the other side, holding onto his arms. And as the contraction would come and I needed to bear down and push, I would like pull on him and pull backwards as I was like pushing. And he said that, and like, my husband is like 90 plus kilos. He's strong. He's very strong. And he said, like, the strength that I was pulling back on him was like almost pulling his body weight over. Like, we just must have super strength as women during birth. But also, I'm totally jumping around, but also how incredible and how amazing that our bodies innately know what to do and know what's happening. Like, I knew through that whole labor, like, something's changed. I can feel like you just have this knowing, and I never expected, you don't realize when you've never done it before. I never expected to feel like that, but your body just has this knowing. I knew that I was ready to push, having never experienced those sensations before. So I just think that's absolutely fascinating. Anyway, back to the story. So I was in that whole pushing phase. The reason why I pushed for so long at home, because we did actually need a transfer to hospital, but the reason why I pushed for so long at home was because the midwives were, they were using a Doppler to check on baby's heart rate. There was no signs of distress. I was fine. I was still, there was no reason at that stage to transfer to hospital. It was just about giving me the time and space that I needed to, get this baby down, basically. But it did come to a point where they were like, look, we really need you to, like, things haven't sort of progressed recently, and we need you to either push this baby out or we need to consider going to hospital and transferring to hospital. Not in those words. They were very beautiful and nurturing and supportive in the way that they spoke to me about it. But it was about like, yes, we need to think about transferring to hospital. And it was funny because that whole time that I was pushing, I never felt any pain. Like, it wasn't like transition. I never felt pain. Certainly it was intense. I'm pretty certain my husband said that I made like the most like wildest noises, but I never felt pain, and it wasn't, and I was in just this total, like, I was in my own world, in this total labor land, this other world that I guess I knew what was going on around me, but I didn't at the same time really know. I was just in my own space. There is something really important during labor is that we, as women, go into our hind brain, our mammalian brain, reptilian brain. I'm not sure. Mammalian brain. I'm not sure. I can't remember what it's called. I'm having a baby brain moment, but it's essentially it's our primal brain. It's the brain that we're not thinking. We're not in our analytical brain and thinking and stressing and worrying and doing all of those things we're used to doing, and our body is just doing its thing. And I was so into that part of my brain and body, and it wasn't until the midwife started talking about transferring to hospital that I kind of came out of it. And I remember looking up and I realized what was going on around me. And I realized that the sun was starting to come down, like not setting, but starting to come down. And in that moment, I realized that I'd been there for a long time. It could have been 5 minutes for all I knew. But in that moment, I realized that I'd been there for quite a long time. And I started to sort of think, oh, I haven't got this baby out yet. Like, why is it taking so long? And yeah, really, things definitely changed. So they called an ambulance because we decided to transfer. And when the ambulance got there, things definitely changed for me in the sense of that's when my stress hormones really ramped up. And because I was anxious about going to hospital. I was anxious about what was going on. And I remember lying in the back of the ambulance because I had to lie down on my back so they could strap me in. And it was so intense. Like, it was so painful on my back. I didn't know this at the time, but my baby had turned posterior. So it was, just a really painful position for me to be in. And so we transferred to hospital. I also remember when they were getting ready to sort of leave in the ambulance, one of the paramedics said to me, I can give you some morphine for the pain. And I remember thinking in that moment, like, yes, just give it to me. Like, I just want this pain to be gone. And my midwife, she came in the ambulance with me and she said, oh no, she doesn't need it. And I was so grateful for her for saying that. Not that decision's wrong for anyone, by the way, but because I had decided that I didn't want any pain relief. I didn't want any intervention if it didn't need to happen. And so I was really grateful that she said that because I didn't need it and I was okay. And it was absolutely fine to not have it. But it just shows you that in that moment of like vulnerability and discomfort that it can be really hard to make decisions. Anyway, we got transferred to hospital. My poor husband had to drive. It was like peak hour traffic we were in the northern suburbs, like through Coburg. And the ambulance got to like drive up the tram tracks. So we got there quite quickly. My poor husband has his own story about turning up to the hospital, frantically running around trying to find where in the hospital I was and getting sent around to all different places. Like, oh no, she's probably in emergency, go there. Oh no, she's not there, go back to maternity. Anyway, he took so long to come up to the hospital room. I was transferred to the maternity ward, to a room, because it wasn't an emergency. There was nothing actually wrong, or, there was no emergency situation at the time. Meanwhile, I'm up in the room waiting for him to turn up, trying to hold this baby in and stop my contractions. Like, I'm like in there going, I don't want to have this baby while my husband's not here. And my midwife's like, you just need to let your body do its thing and stop trying to hold that in. So he eventually got there. I got checked, like, long story short, I got checked by an obstetrician. Obviously did agree to, I don't know if she did, I'm fairly certain she did like a vaginal exam she needed to check the positioning of the baby. And so obviously we agreed to that because they were just trying to work out like why he hadn't come down or hadn't come out yet. And what she realized is that he had turned posterior and was coming through face forward. He'd deflexed his chin, so his little chin was up, and he was trying to come through with his face forward, so the widest dimension of his head, whereas they're meant to tuck their chin and put their little head down and have their little head come through first, which is the smallest diameter of their head. So she sort of said, look, I just don't think you're going to get him out like this. He's essentially stuck in there. I don't think you're going to get him out. We could look at doing a manual rotation, and I can try and turn him and see if you can birth him that way. And I was like, okay, well, let's do that. Meanwhile, I was I'd lost my confidence. I was really quite stressed and anxious at this stage. I absolutely felt the pain, like I could feel the pain in my back. So it was completely different to when I was at home. And really, like, I think about it and you're like, our beautiful cascade of hormones that happens supports the intensity and the pain in pregnancy and labor. And when you're stressed and cortisol's rushing through your body, it drops oxytocin and we don't get those beautiful hormones that we need to support us. And one of the biggest, mistakes that I made throughout the whole labor is I didn't drink enough water. I didn't eat enough food earlier on. So really early on, I lost my appetite and I just didn't think about it. And we'd prepped all of this labor snacks and all of the drinks and all the, the electrolyte drinks and things like that. And I just completely forgot about having it. And it wasn't until I was in the pushing phase at home that I realized that I was quite thirsty and probably needed some energy, and my husband would give me sips of water and feed me some lollies for some glucose. But it was probably a little bit too late. I really hadn't fueled myself for that whole thing. So by this stage, I was quite exhausted. It had been a long journey, and my body was tired. I was tired. I was emotionally tired. Anyway, it was a really busy night in the hospital as well. And this was during COVID. So there was a lot of restrictions. There was a lot of, the hospitals were really run off their feet and really understaffed. Well, not understaffed, but there was just a lot of people in hospital. And the obstetrician was sort of in and out because she was going to try and do this manual rotation. And she came back, she gave me some, because I didn't want to have an epidural. So the other option was to have some injections into my vagina to numb the area so that she could do this manual rotation. And so I opted for that. And then by the time she came back to look at doing the actual rotation, the heart rate, our baby's heart rate had dropped, and so they sort of felt that there was signs of distress, and I was rushed off to emergency for a cesarean. So it wasn't even it was such an emergency situation. It was literally code blue, whatever they say in the hospital, that it wasn't a conversation where I had an option about we think you should have a cesarean. It was, we actually need to get this baby out now. And I was rushed, really rushed down to emergency for that. And anyway, my husband was able to be there. They said to him, look, if we can get a spinal block in her, you can come in and be in there. But if we can't, we'll need to do this under general anesthetic, and you won't be able to be in there. So luckily, they did get the spinal block in. So it wasn't an epidural, it was a spinal block, because I think the epidural takes quite a while to kick in. So that was still a needle into the spine. And oh my gosh, I can tell you, having to keep completely still while your body is contracting, to have a needle put into your spine is quite a lot. I remember by this stage, my body was having such forceful contractions. It was every time I had a contraction, my whole body and belly and everything would just uncontrollably contract and bear down and push so hard without me actually doing anything. So getting into theatre was quite a lot, because there's a lot of staff that were running around. It feels quite a frantic and it just feels like such a stressful environment. But I will say that my midwives were there. They were so supportive. And the anaesthetist that was there was so lovely. And he literally stood next to me the whole time and was talking to me and making me feel really comfortable. The staff were actually really wonderful there. And my husband got to be there, so that was really nice. And they pulled him out and he was actually fine. All his APGAR scores were fine. So they checked him, and I was able to have him and hold him straight away, literally in theatre on the table there, because he was okay. So I guess maybe he wasn't as in distress as what they thought. So I got to hold him, but I remember as they were stitching me up and I was holding him on my chest, the adrenaline really kicked in my body, and I think it was either the drugs wearing off or just the adrenaline coming down off the adrenaline, and I was shaking uncontrollably. And I remember saying to my husband, "You have to hold him, because I can't hold him. I'm worried I'm going to drop him." And that was it was a really awful feeling. So yeah, that was my birth. That was my absolute wild ride from an unplanned home birth to a hospital transfer, all the way through to an emergency Caesar that I never expected to happen. I will say, like, when we, like, leading up to the birth, we had with our midwives our birth plan meeting. So you have like a big appointment about where you talk about all the different options and preferences and things that you do and don't want in your birth. And obviously, like, notwithstanding the requirement or, like, you know, what they believe is medically necessary and life-saving. But you go through all your options. And I remember talking about C-sections, and I remember just thinking to myself, yeah, well, you know, that's never going to happen. It didn't enter my mind that my birth would go that way. And I think that was a big lesson for me, is that we can only control the controllables, and there is so much unknown when it comes to birth. And we can prepare ourselves and put ourselves in the best position. And I, of course, do have thoughts on whether my birth would have gone down that way and down that road if I had made other decisions earlier on, like, for example, had actually planned for a home birth. But at the same time, I don't dwell on that anymore. I really don't, because the decisions were made, and that was my story. And that was, you know, I get to learn lessons from that, and I get to grow from that. And everything turned out, you know, my son was born healthy and I was healthy. And so it is what it is. So after the surgery, we were transferred to a waiting area, and I was able to breastfeed and have skin to skin. And then we were transferred to our room, and my husband couldn't stay very long because it was in the middle of lockdown. And so it was just me overnight with our newborn baby, barely being able to move, and certainly not being able to get up out of bed because I just had this surgery. So that was quite hard. But in the morning, my husband came back, and I remember, I think it was before I came back, I remember one of the nurses came in, and I said to her, because we still had our private midwife, so they come to you every day at home post-birth for a certain amount of days. I can't remember, maybe it's 5 days, and then every week for a few weeks. And so my preference was to go home as soon as possible. I didn't want to be at hospital. I didn't want to eat the hospital food. I had a terrible night's sleep just hearing, like, all the lights and the buzzing and all that. I just wanted to be home in my bed. And I remember the nurse coming in, and I was like, I'm going to go home today. And she's like, oh no, darling, you're going to be here for a few days. And I was like, no, I'm going home. I've got my private midwife. I'm going home. Anyway, they basically said to me, you can only go home if you can get up out of bed and walk yourself and have a shower and go to the toilet yourself. Otherwise, we can't discharge you. And I was like, right, I'm on this. I'm going to do this. So I remember getting out of bed, and this is literally, like, I literally had surgery at like 6 o'clock at night, and at like 9 o'clock the next morning, I was getting myself up out of bed. Absolutely insane, but I was so determined. And I remember standing on my feet, like getting out of bed, swinging over, standing on my feet, and my husband being there. And I was like, oh, I don't trust myself. I don't trust my body. Like, everything just felt just so different. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this, but I really want to go home. And I was like, I was so wobbly and just, it was just really, like, such a daunting thing to do. And I remember I was like, just stand right next to me as I walk. And I remember just slowly plodding along to the bathroom, and I did it, and I had a shower myself, and I went to the toilet. And so I got to go home, which was so nice. I just wanted to be, like, in my own space, in my own bed, with my own food, not hospital food. I was really, like, set on recovering and having proper food to nourish me to do so. So yeah, that was our story. I have actually just realized that I've been talking for like an hour, and so I'm going to split this episode into two and do part 2 where I'll talk about my current pregnancy, the different journey that I've had, I guess, in this pregnancy, the choices that I've made. But I think this time more on the spiritual side of pregnancy, and just, yeah. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for joining us on the Empowered Flow podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, I'd love you to share it with a friend and take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support means the world and fuels our mission to empower women everywhere. You can also reach out to me on Instagram at Tris Alexandra Nutrition. Sending big love. I'll catch you in the next episode.